We're going to talk about photosynthesis. So this is part of the bioenergetics na topic. So we will divide bioenergetics into photosynthesis as well as cellular respiration. So for this morning, we're going to focus our discussion with the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is an anabolic carbon dioxide requiring process that uses light energy in the form of photons and water to produce organic macromolecules. So photosynthesis is an anabolic process. When we say anabolic, it's a process wherein it undergoes synthesis of complex molecules, which in this case we have glucose. And for plants to be able to produce those glucose molecules, they need to have carbon dioxide as part of their um, molecules na requirement as well as water. So carbon dioxide and water will be used as the recipe to make glucose. Then the light energy will be used later on to um, trigger the reaction. So we have this chemical equation or chemical um, reaction of the carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose and oxygen. So our reactants here is carbon dioxide. We have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water. And it will yield C6H12O6, which is our glucose, plus 6 molecules of oxygen. And of course, the sun or the light energy from the sun is used again to trigger the reaction for photosynthesis. So, kung walang sun, we cannot proceed with, the plants cannot proceed with photosynthesis. So, kahit meron kayong carbon dioxide and water, but the photons from the sun is needed para makagawa ng glucose. So where does photosynthesis take place? So of course, one of the main part ng ating plant is the leaves, and that's where they are doing the photosynthesis process. So the plants, of course, are the common or commonly known na living organism that does photosynthesis. But there are other living organisms that can do photosynthesis as well. For example, protists and bacteria. So some of them can do photosynthesis, but mostly we know na undergo ng photosynthesis process are the plants. Plants are autotrophs, which means they are self-producers. So they can produce their own food. So in what particular location does photosynthesis takes place? It's in the leaves. Then we have the following parts of the leaves. We have the stoma and the mesophyll cells. So if you can still remember yung discussion natin about plant cells, di ba we have mesophyll cells, and the mesophyll cells are divided into spongy and palisade. While the stoma naman or stomata are the entry point for the gases or yung kailangan to produce glucose, and also it is used as an exit point for oxygen. So the stoma is composed of 2 guard cells that will open and close depende kung ano yung kailangan ng plants. While the mesophyll cells contains mostly mga chloroplast, and the chloroplast is the organelle that is needed for the plants to do photosynthesis. So we have the stomata or the stoma. So again, these are pores in a plant's cuticle. Particularly, stomata are found sa ilalim na part ng leaf, those leaf na not facing the sun. So doon natin makita usually yung mga stomata or stoma. So again, this is the entry point or exit point of gases, and sometimes it is also used to admit or kumaga accept water, especially if mayroong water na napunta dun sa leaves. So the stomach can also be used to accept water, but for mostly for plants, for them to be able to survive, they need to have water na kinukuha from the roots, not from the leaves. So again, the stomata are made up of guard cells, which opens and closes depending on the need of the plants. So if they need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, they usually tends to open up, and they tend to close it down, especially if they need to contain yung water sa loob ng leaf. So dyan papasok si carbon dioxide and lalabas naman si oxygen. Doon pa rin sa stomata. Then we have the mesophyll cells. So again, the mesophyll cells contain the chloroplasts. The chloroplasts are the organelles needed for the plants to do their photosynthesis process. And the mesophyll cells are divided into palisade mesophyll and spongy mesophyll. So just a review, palisade mesophyll cells are the cells that are usually found on the side where the leaf is facing the sun, and they are usually tight so that they can have the maximum amount of photons na makuha from the sun. While the spongy mesophyll cells naman are typically mayroong spaces in between them so that they can have space also for the carbon dioxide or even oxygen to fit in the other side naman ng leaf. So since it's a cell, mostly mesophyll cells contains most of the organelles of a cell. But mas marami lang yung chloroplast nila compared to the other cells sa isang plant. So si mesophyll cells, mas marami silang chloroplast. So for chloroplast, it's the organelle that is unique for plants, and it's where the photosynthesis takes place. For chloroplast, I think we have already discussed this, no, na yung kanilang structure, but let's just have a short review of their structure just in case nakalimutan na. So chloroplast is a double membraned organelle, which means meron siyang outer membrane and inner membrane. So they need to have double protection for them to be able to be protected, since they are one of the most important organelle of the plants. So inside the chloroplast is a fluid-filled space called the stroma. Then in the stroma are the different thylakoid. So a thylakoid is like a disc, and when they are piled up together, they are called granum. So that's just the basic na mga structures of a chloroplast. And of course, connecting the granum or the lamella, yung parang bridge nila from one granum to the other. So, excuse me. So that's the structures of chloroplast. So for the thylakoid, si thylakoid naman, meron din siyang membrane in itself. So it has its own membrane. Then sa loob niya is again a fluid-filled space called the thylakoid space. So for chloroplast, we have the stroma. For thylakoid, we have the thylakoid space. Now, why are plants green? What makes their color green? So the color that they have is actually the cause of a reflection of the green wavelength that will bounce back to us. That's why we can see green. Now, the green there doesn't mean na green ang color sa plants, but ang color niya is green for us, for humans. It's because that's the type of light that is reflected towards our eyes. So, kung usaang mag-reflect sa tua, muna siya ang color na ma-perceive nato sa isa ka object. So, plants are green because of the chlorophyll pigment. So, these chlorophyll pigments or chlorophyll molecules are found in the thylakoid membrane. So, they are embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and this type of pigment absorbs all the wavelengths of light except for color green or your green na wavelength. Kasi every colors of the light has different wavelengths. So each of those light have different wavelengths, and chlorophyll absorbs all of them except for the green wavelength. That's why it is reflected towards us, and that's why it makes the plant color green. Chlorophyll have a magnesium ion in the center. So sa kanyang structure, meron siyang magnesium ion sa kanyang center. And the chlorophyll pigments harvest energy or photons by absorbing certain wavelengths, particularly blue and red wavelength are the most important for them. But still, they can accept other wavelengths. However, they tend to again reflect the green. That's why yun yung nakikita natin for the plants. So the green wavelength was not absorbed. So sa lahat ng wavelengths na yun, green lang yung hindi niya ina-absorb, and thus yun lang yung nagre-reflect sa atin, and that's what makes the plant green. But for others naman na merong different colors, they have different pigments for that. So for example, yung other trees, yung mga temperate na mga trees, or those trees na makikita natin sa mga European countries, diba? They will change their color during the fall or autumn season. So the reason for that is nag-diminish na yung chlorophyll pigments nila, exposing the other pigments. So once kasi mamatay na yung or almost dying na yung leaf ng plants, they tend to lose chlorophyll, but since they still have other pigments in their structure, then those other pigments naman will show the different colors or will reflect the different colors. That's why they have color changes that is happening during the autumn season. So the wavelength of light that is visible for humans eye, so we have this wavelength lang, and each wavelength has differences in their um, length. So meron siyang differences sa kanilang length, particularly the distance between one wave to the other wave. So for the wavelength of light, the shorter the wave, the more energy that they have, while the longer the wave, the lesser energy that they have. So in this case, mas maraming energy for purple kasi mas maliit yung wave niya, while si red naman, mas lesser yung energy. So this is the only visible light for us humans, but there are still mga um, waves or rays that we cannot see or yung um, invisible to the naked eye. So we have example, gamma rays, X-rays, UV rays, infrared, microwaves, tsaka radio waves. So those are waves that are invisible to us. So only a small portion of that is visible light. At ito lang yung nakikita natin na colors. So we can only just mix or sometimes add na lang to have different kinds of color pa. But this is the only visible color for humans. So light behaves as if it were composed of units, and those units or packets of energy travels in waves. And that is called the photons. Okay? So the photons travels in waves. So if you can observe the illustration that we have, the red photons actually have a longer length of wave compared to the blue photons. Which means if we're comparing the two, mas malaming energy si blue compared kay red. At of course, mas malaki yung wavelength ni red compared kay blue. Now, this red and blue na mga wavelengths are actually absorbed by chlorophyll. Okay, so yan yung ina-accept nila. Yan yung important for them. But still, they can accept other colors. So, yan lang yung top 2 nila na wavelength na gusto. So, that's blue and red wavelength. So, this figure shows us what's the peak absorption of each colors of wavelengths of light. So for chlorophyll, they tend to absorb more blue, just like here, and red. And so they tend to absorb more blue and red colors, while they can absorb also violet, orange, and sometimes yellow, but mas mababa si green. Yan. So mas mababa si green for them. So that's the absorption ng chlorophyll or rate ng absorption of chlorophyll. Okay, so I have discussed this already, yung changes of colors during the fall. So once again, sa isang leaf, hindi lang si chlorophyll pigment ang present. Marami pa siyang other na pigments present in them. And when the plants na malapit ng ma-deteriorate yung kanyang leaf, they tend to lose a lot of chlorophyll, exposing the other pigments. So in the absence of chlorophyll, the other pigments will do their work, and thus they will reflect another color. kasi hindi naman sila chlorophyll. So they tend to reflect other colors. So example of other pigments, we have carotenoids. The carotenoids are the pigments that reflects red and yellow, red, orange, yellow colors. So yan yung ano nila, yung colors na nire-reflect nila. While the other one is phycobilins. Phycobilins. And that pigment reflects blue and violet colors. So blue and violet for phycobilins, then carotenoids, red, yellow, orange. Ito yung makikita natin sa mga gulay na mayroong orange na color. Just like carrots, for example. So, yan yung pigment nila, yung carotenoids. So, those two are the examples of other pigments present in plants. Pero kasi during a time na healthy pa ang isang plant, mas marami silang chlorophyll. Yan. So, yun. In addition to the chlorophyll pigments, there are other pigments present. During the fall, the green chlorophyll pigments are greatly reduced, revealing the other pigments. Carotenoids are pigments that are either red or yellow or orange. Photosynthesis is an example of a redox reaction. So in redox reaction, it's the transfer of one or more electrons from one reactant to another. So there are two types of redox reactions. We have oxidation and reduction. Kaya siya tinawag na redox. It's a play on words na red for reduction and ox for oxidation. So redox. So for the redox, particularly sa oxidation, the oxidation happens when there is a loss of electrons from a substance or the gain of oxygen. That's why it's called oxidation. So a substance is said to be oxidized when it gains oxygen, but it lost a lot of electrons. So example, we have this chemical equation kanina for our photosynthesis. And these two molecules undergoes the oxidation reaction. So if you can observe, the reactant that we have is water. So we have 6 molecules of water, but after the oxidation process, the oxygen of water doubled the number. So from 6 to 12. At saan galing yung other na oxygen? Galing dun kang carbon dioxide. So si carbon dioxide shares its shares its oxygen to water, and si water lost its electrons, and that process is the oxidation process. Okay, so just simply remember, basta gain of oxygen, that's oxidation. Okay? Then the other one is the reduction reaction. So the reduction reaction naman is the opposite of oxidation. So here, the substance gain electrons or the substance lost oxygen. So in this chemical equation, we have these two molecules naman undergoing the reduction process. So we have 6 carbon dioxide, naging glucose siya. So from 12 molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide, naging 6 na lang yung oxygen. So that's the reduction reaction. So nag-gain siya ng electrons but nag-loss siya ng oxygen. So for photosynthesis, we have actually two main parts here. It is divided into light reactions and yung light independent reaction. So light reaction, or also known as the light dependent reaction, is the first part or the part of photosynthesis wherein they need light para maka-form sila ng ATP and NADPH. Itong mga ATP and NADPH later is used during the light-independent reaction. So the main goal of the light reaction is to produce energy in the form of ATP and NADPH galing sa solar energy. So after light-dependent reaction, doon naman tayo pupunta sa light-independent reaction, or also known as the Calvin cycle, or the carbon fixation, or the C3 fixation. So this time, in the light-independent reaction, we will use the energy produced in the light-dependent to make sugar or glucose. So that's the breakdown of photosynthesis. So for now, let's proceed with our discussion dun sa light-dependent reaction. So the light-dependent reaction or the light reaction occurs in the thylakoid membranes. During the light reaction, there are two possible routes for the electron flow. First, the cyclic electron flow, and second is the non-cyclic electron flow. So, ito yung possible na route or route ng electrons. So, pwede siya cyclic, which means pabalik-balik, while pwede din siya non-cyclic, which means straight lang, not straight, but diretso lang siya. So, let's start with cyclic electron flow. Again, we are still in the light dependent, which means we need light for these processes. So cyclic electron flow occurs in the thylakoid membrane. They use photosystem 1 only. Photosystem is a molecule pa rin with a lot of chlorophyll pigments in them, and thus it aids in the light dependent reaction. So in the cyclic electron flow, meron siyang reaction center, which we call the P700 reaction center, or also known as chlorophyll A. So this chlorophyll A is in the photosystem 1. Okay? Now this chlorophyll A accepts light or photons with 700 nanometers na wavelength, which means it accepts the red wavelength. Then after that, they will trigger the reaction in the thylakoid membrane, and then they will do the electron transport chain to generate ATP. So that's the end product of the cyclic electron flow, yung ATP. So this is the process of the cyclic electron flow. So the sun gives photons or releases photons, of course, and then the light is accepted in the photosystem 1. Now, this mga color light green or apple green na color surrounding the reaction center are also pigments, chlorophyll pigments. It's just that mayroon silang parang mothership or yun nga nasa center nila, which we call the P700 reaction center. So the photons are absorbed by the other pigments and then they will pass it to the reaction center. The reaction center gives electrons or loses its electrons, then it will be accepted in the primary electron acceptor. The primary electron acceptor sends its electron down the electron transport chain. So these are some of the molecules. May mga name ito sila. The primary electron acceptor sends an electron to this molecule. Then the electron here will be transferred to this molecule again. Then itong another molecule na to sends the electron here and ibabalik niya dito sa reaction center. The process of transferring electrons from one molecule to another produces ATP. So ang main goal here is to produce ATP, and they can only do that using the electron transport chain. So if you can observe, the electron just goes back to the reaction center, and then we have the cyclic flow. So pabalik-balik lang siya. So that's for the cyclic electron flow. Then for the non-cyclic electron flow, it still occurs in the thylakoid membrane. Now it uses two photosystems or PS. Well, we have photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. So PS2 and PS1 are used here in the non-cyclic electron flow, and they have the P680 reaction center and also the P700 reaction center, as well as electron transport chain. They also use that one. So the non-cyclic electron flow generates oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. So mas marami siyang naproproduce na product compared to the cyclic electron flow, wherein they only have ATP na ma-produce. So for the non-cyclic electron flow, this is the process. So let's start with on the left side. So on the left side, of course, we have the sun, and it releases the wavelengths or the photons, and it will be accepted by the accessory pigments. So the accessory pigments accepts the photon and shares it to the reaction center, which is the P680 for photosystem 2. So the photosystem 2 releases an electron or two electrons rather to the primary electron acceptor. So the primary electron acceptor sends the electrons down the electron transport chain. So they undergo the electron transport chain, so they can now produce ATP. Then the electrons will be passed through the photosystem 1, and they can only process the electrons by, of course, having another photon from the sun. So the photosystem 1 will accept the photon, making the electrons excited. So mag-bounce-bounce sila dito sa ato ang accessory pigments until ma-accept sila sa reaction center. Then, they will be transferred to the primary electron acceptor of PS1, and um, el- um, they will undergo another electron transport chain. This time, they will produce NADPH. So since it's a non-cyclic electron flow, the photosystem 2 needs to replenish its lost electrons. Since naman siya nawala na electron sa iyaha, asa man siya mokuha og para mo puli nga electron sa iyaha. So here we will use water. So we have H2O. We will separate H2O in the process of hydrolysis. So i-separate nato siya. So we have now two hydrogen molecules and oxygen. So yung electrons ni hydrogen will be transferred to photosystem 2 to replenish the lost electrons kasi nga non-cyclic, walang babalik sa kanya. So the hydrogen will give its electrons to the photosystem 2. And we have now oxygen as a byproduct or waste product. So we have oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. That's the product for non-cyclic electron flow. So again, this is just the part of the light-dependent reaction wherein we're going to need sunlight. So for plants, they're actually doing a lot of light-dependent reaction during the day. Then at night, usually they do the Calvin cycle or the light-independent reaction. So that's the two processes. Now let's proceed to and so just the short na summary of the products ng non-cyclic electron flow.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions. the light-dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated. In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH. When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Calvin cycle reactions.
Okay, so since photosynthesis is a redox reaction pa rin, so we have the processes of the reduction and oxidation that is happening for the light-dependent reaction. So here we have reduction when ADP was added with the phosphate molecule. So reduction siya because they gain electrons. Then NADP added with hydrogen. So naging NADPH. Again, they are reduced because they gained hydrogen. No, they gained electrons. While si water naman was oxidized, so na ano siya na nag-loss siya ng electrons. Now, in the process of photosynthesis, we have also another process that is happening or that helps in the process of photosynthesis. So we have chemiosmosis. The chemiosmosis powers the ATP synthesis or the production of ATP. So this process is located in the thylakoid membranes. In the chemiosmosis na part, they use electron transport chain or ETC and ATP synthase, an enzyme to make ATP. So here we will explain how electron transport chain synthesizes ATP. And we have also a process of photophosphorylation. So this process is the term that is used when um, adenosine diphosphate, this one is added with a phosphate molecule to make ATP. So ADP plus P equals ATP, and that's photophosphorylation. So all of these processes are happening in the thylakoid membrane. So let's have a scenario of chemiosmosis. Ayan. So here, this is our thylakoid membrane, for example. And inside is the thylakoid space. Now, embedded in the thylakoid membrane are the photosystem 2, photosystem 1, then this one is the ATP synthase, itong purple. Now, in the process of chemiosmosis, the hydrogen protons undergoes proton pumping. Diba? We have proton pumping as part of the active transport for plants. So they move the protons from low concentration to high concentration. Now this high concentrated na hydrogen protons in the thylakoid space should move back outside to the low hydrogen concentration na area via the ATP synthase. Why they need to go back? Para makabuhat ta og ATP. Because ATP synthase cannot do its work without the presence of hydrogen, which is important for them. Now, this relationship is called co-transport. When we say co-transport, it means that as the hydrogen protons are transported back outside, the ATP is also being synthesized. So that's the importance of chemiosmosis. So we call it chemiosmosis kasi it's just osmosis but for chemicals, not for water. So yan yung process niya. Again, kailangan ipapasok si hydrogen sa loob para lalabas ulit siya, but dadaan sila dapat dun sa ATP synthase. So yun yung reason why kailangan natin ipapasok si hydrogen sa loob. Then we have the light independent reaction, or also known as the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is also known as carbon fixation. Plants that are doing Calvin cycle are called C3 plants. And C3 plants comprises 80% of plants on Earth because most of the plants do Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle naman occurs in the stroma, not in the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so the Calvin cycle, the focus here is to produce glucose. So for the Calvin cycle, we're going to use the ATP and NADPH that was produced in the light-dependent reaction. We're also going to use carbon dioxide. And then we will undergo the process of Calvin cycle to produce glucose. So to produce a molecule of glucose, it takes 6 turns for them, and they use 18 ATP and 12 NADPH. So that's the amount of ATP and NADPH that are needed by the plants to make a molecule of glucose. So this is the cycle of Calvin cycle, or also known as carbon fixation. So here we have, um, we'll start at the phase 1. So let's start with the phase 1. Again, this is happening in the stroma. Okay. So we have 3 molecules of carbon dioxide that enters the cycle. We call that phase as carbon fixation. The carbon dioxide is met by this molecule. We call them ribulose bisphosphate, or RUBP for short. So the RUBP is actually a molecule produced from the previous Calvin cycle. So it's already there. They only need to meet carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide will fix itself to the ribulose biphosphate or bisphosphate, and that's why it's called carbon fixation, yung tawag. And we have an enzyme that aids in that process. So we have Rubisco as the enzyme. So si Rubisco is short for ribulose bisphosphate coenzyme. Okay, so we have Rubisco. So we have 3 molecules of ribulose bisphosphate. If you can notice, meron silang 5 gray circle dyan sa loob. That gray circles there are carbon molecules, which means that RUBP is a 5-carbon molecule. And meron siya naka-attach na phosphate sa kanyang gilid. So each side of them have phosphate. Now, after dyan, papasok si ribulose bisphosphate dito sa phase 1, and papasok si carbon dioxide. They will now become 3-phosphoglycerate. What happens here is yung isang circle ng carbon attaches itself to the ribulose bisphosphate. Since we have 3 molecules of RUBP and 3 molecules of carbon dioxide, we were able to divide them into 6. So we have now 6 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerate. Bakit siya naging phosphoglycerate? Because we divided the ribulose bisphosphate into half. So 1 molecule of ribulose bisphosphate with the additional carbon will yield 2,3-phosphoglycerate. Yung number 3 dyan represents kung naasaan naka-attach yung phosphate molecule, which is in the 3rd carbon. That's why it's called 3. So we have now 6 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerate, and they will now undergo the phase of reduction. That's phase 2. So in the phase 2, gagamitin na natin yung ATP galing kay light-dependent reaction. So anong gagawin natin sa ATP? We will get its phosphate and transfer them to 3-phosphoglycerate. So what will happen, si ATP will change into ADP kasi nawalan na siya ng isang phosphate. So nandito na tayo ha. ADP will go back to the light-dependent reaction para maging ATP ulit siya. Then, yung phosphate naman attaches on the first carbon ng 3-phosphoglycerate. Now, the name na nila is called 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Why 1,3? Because the phosphate molecule are attached to the first carbon and the third carbon. Then we have added the prefix bis, which means dalawa. So, bisphosphoglycerate. Then that molecule will be again reduced when NADPH enters. So, saan galing si NADPH? Galing siya sa light-dependent reaction. So, NADPH will go back here sa Calvin cycle. Ngayon, ang gagawin niya is tatanggalin niya yung phosphate na nadagdag kanina and replaced it with hydrogen. Okay? Kaya si NADPH naging NADP na lang. Kasi yung hydrogen niya, ibinigay niya doon kang 3-phosphoglycerate. But before they can add the hydrogen, they need to remove first the phosphate molecule. So, tatanggalin niya yung phosphate. That's why we have 6 NADP plus here and 6 phosphate ions. And that process converts the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate molecule into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay? So, si glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is different from 3-phosphoglycerate. Why? It's because si glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate was added with hydrogen. So, nabigyan na siya ng extra hydrogen, which means it's a different na, molecule. So, out of the 6 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, one of them will be used later on to produce glucose. So, sa 6 na yon, kukunin natin yung isa para gagawa natin ng glucose. While the 5 remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate will undergo phase 3, which is the regeneration of ribulose bisphosphate. So in phase 3, our goal is to change back the molecule into ribulose biphosphate or bisphosphate. So, ibabalik natin siya, gagawin natin siyang bisphosphate ulit. So, what will happen is we were just going to rearrange yung 5 G3P na yon at gagawin nating 5 carbon na ribulose bisphosphate. So, if we're going to look at here, 5 times 3 equals pila? 15, di ba? So, we have now 15. I-divide natin siya by 5. So, we have 3. So, we have 3 molecules of ribulose phosphate. But, kailangan natin siya gawing bisphosphate. So, paano natin siya gagawing bisphosphate? We just have to add ATP. Kasi nga, nawalan siya ng phosphate, di ba? So, we need to add the phosphate. So, kukuha ulit tayo ng ATP galing kay light-dependent reaction and then we attach it to the first carbon. Thus, we have now regenerated the ribulose bisphosphate. But looking at our output, we only have one molecule of G3P, which is a 3-carbon molecule. Now, glucose, if we're going to remember yung chemical reaction, they need 6 molecules of carbon, right? So, di ba, C6H12O6. So, di ba dapat ganyan yung kanilang molecule? But we only have 3 carbons here. So, babalik ulit yung process until such time that we double this up, making the glucose molecule. So, babalik ulit yung process, papasok ulit yung 3 carbon dioxide. They will now separate. Si carbon will be used later on or attaches later on kang ribulose bisphosphate and the cycle continues until makabuo tayo ng glucose. So that's how plants create glucose. So this is the light-independent reaction.
The Calvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is then used to make glucose, fatty acids, or glycerol. It takes 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to make 1 molecule of glucose phosphate. Thus, the Calvin cycle has to run 6 times to produce 1 molecule of glucose. These molecules can remove their phosphate and add fructose to form sucrose, the molecule plants use to transport carbohydrates throughout their system. Glucose phosphate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of starch and cellulose. Plants produce sugars to use as storage molecules and structural components for their own benefit. By utilizing the energy of the sun, along with inputs of water and carbon dioxide, plants act as glucose factories. Photosynthetic organisms are the primary producers of glucose on the planet. They also produce oxygen gas as a byproduct, and thus serve as the foundation of life, providing food and oxygen for the complex food webs on both land and in the oceans.